Um, Welcome and good evening. My name is Bruce Campbell. I'm the chair of the Department of Hispanic Studies here at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. Both the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University occupy the original homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. We honor, respect, and acknowledge the indigenous peoples forcibly removed from this territory, whose connection remains today. St. Benedict's Monastery and St. John's Abbey previously operated boarding schools for Native children. Now, students, faculty, and staff are working to repair relationships with our Native Nation neighbors. I'm delighted to introduce to you our speaker for tonight's event. Dr. Mike Mena identifies as a Mexican-American researcher and is an assistant professor at Brooklyn College, CUNY, City University of New York. Mike focuses on the ideological perceptions of race and language in the context of American education. He has published his work in various peer-reviewed journals, including Journal of Linguistic Anthropology, Language in Society, and Educational Linguistics. Mike is also an educational technologist and public intellectual. His internationally renowned award-winning YouTube channel, The Social Life of Language, serves as a contemporary and activist pedagogical model to those interested in producing accessible and engaging educational content designed to engage wider publics, with special attention paid to reaching students of color, as well as promoting the work of marginalized scholars. For his service and media expertise, he was awarded the Society for Linguistic Anthropology's Intellectually Informed Public Activism Award in 2019 and the Carnegie Educational Technologist Fellowship in 2021. Dr. Mena will speak to us tonight about what he terms soft linguistic terrorism, which I'm paraphrasing here as techniques for the racial governance of social and linguistic norms. Is that accurate? Not bad. Please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Mike.
Okay, thank you. Let's press play on this. Bad at technology. Is it working? Close enough. Okay, wow, so many people here. Okay, here we go. So, welcome friends. I'm Dr. Mike Mena, and today's talk is called Soft Linguistic Terrorism, 21st Century Re-Articulations. And a quick note on what you guys are seeing on the screen here. So this is the South Texas University that I'm going to be talking about today. So this is deep South Texas. We're as south as you can possibly go. But I wanted to show you an image of what it looks like from a local's perspective, because I'm from here. And this part of Texas comes out on TV a lot, on Fox News in particular. Anytime there's any talk about the border wall, they're talking about this place right here. You can actually, from one of the campuses, you can see the border wall from one of the campuses. So that's how close we are to the US-Mexico border, literally as south as you can get in the United States. So up here, this is just to kind of counteract the images that we see on TV of this part of South Texas, but also of the border, where it almost always looks like a desert, and there's dirt roads, and there's no life or whatever. To me, this region looks like this. Grass, palm trees, electricity, the basic things of life. So I like to put these images up just as a kind of counter to what you see on the news. There's nothing very important going on up here. It's just vibes. That's all that's going on, just vibes. Okay, so today we'll be looking at a very specific form of discrimination. Specifically, we're talking about racism that appears to be directed at language more so than the whole person. It appears. It has everything to do with this one concept that we call standard language. It goes by many names. I'm sure you all have heard of half of these. Things like school language, or academic language, or formal language, right? This is what you write your essays in when you turn in your assignments. Sometimes we just call it the language of power. But its most important feature, this standard language, is its assumed perfection and purity. This thing that we call standard language, this perfect object, gave rise to its opposite, non-standard language, which is not correct, not pure, not perfect. This language is tainted by culture, ethnicity, race, gender, etc. And we tend to believe that some people speak standard language while other people do not speak standard language. For example, we might say, oh, well, Latinxes, they don't speak pure English or pure Spanish, they speak Spanglish, right? So impure, impurity, imperfection. We might say black folks speak broken English or lazy English. We might say a person from Appalachia speaks like a hillbilly. These are all ways to fail at achieving this thing called standard language, or producing this thing called standard language. But we must remember, standard language doesn't actually exist in the world. There's no such thing as an ideal speaker, for example. So this is an idealized concept all the way through, not an empirical fact. In fact, a standardized language, a perfect language, has never been proven to exist. Not once, not ever. So that means everyone in here is a non-standard speaker. Everyone, without exception. However, only the folks from marginalized populations will face consequences for it. Whether it's marginalization based on race, class, gender, sexuality. The moment someone questions the legitimacy of your language, they're just questioning the legitimacy of your whole person. Your legitimacy as a person in general, even though it sounds like they're just talking about your language. So today we'll be thinking about what Chicana theorist Gloria Anzaldúa called linguistic terrorism, a theory that she formulated in the 1980s, where she described racist attacks on supposedly non-standard linguistic practices, meaning Mexican folks were imagined as supposedly lacking this pure, standard school English, the formal language, the language of power. They were imagined to speak something else, something totally different, something not as good, something inferior. We gave names to those impure languages as well, names like Tex-Mex, names like Spanglish, both of which are imagined as inferior in comparison to an idealized real standard English or an idealized real standard Spanish. So this standard versus non-standard dichotomy, this linguistic dichotomy, it's kind of been at the heart of linguistic terrorism theory since its beginning. But also we're not in the 1980s anymore, and discrimination, it looks different. So what I wanted to think about was, what would linguistic terrorism look like in the 2020s? Is this idea of standard language still harming people? Is the word terrorism appropriate? Or is it just way too dramatic for this context? In other words, I wanted to think about how to update linguistic terrorism theory for the 21st century. And that's what we're going to do today. But first things first, I want to take a moment here to think about the difference between criticism and critique. When we criticize, we're not looking to improve any situation, right? We're just bashing somebody. It can be fun, whatever. But criticism, the spirit of criticism, or to criticize rather, is destructive. Critique, on the other hand, is a form of criticism that seeks to deconstruct, but then reconstruct back together in a way that's better, hopefully less harmful. Today I speak in the spirit of critique. It's very likely that you will see yourself complicit in the racial processes that I'm speaking of today. By no means is that a criticism of you as a person. It's more so a critique of the institutions that put regular people in certain situations to be complicit, or else they will face consequences. Consequences will follow. And to emphasize how this is about self-reflection. I'm going to be really honest and tell you about a time when I was a 21-year-old high school teacher, brand new high school teacher that made very harmful choices as a teacher. I would venture in to say almost racist practices as a teacher. But like I said, this is about growth, about moving forward, doing better, about being conscious of the fact that when we do things, even tiny things, they can alter the direction of a person's life. So I'll be presenting my research in a narrative form. I'm not going to be using any complex linguistic transcriptions. I'm not going to be using any technical jargon. I won't even be using the PowerPoint. You are welcome for that. Let me begin by giving you some background context, though, of this area, which happens to involve Mexicans in American education. Mexicans and Mexican Americans in education. But the practice of delegitimizing folks because of how they use language, that's kind of happens every day and in every institution, including this one, just like any other institution. But there was something unique about this university that really, really caught my attention because it was trying something new and something progressive and something quite radical, to the point that it almost filled me with hope when I heard about what they were doing at this university. So a few years ago, I had been conducting research at this loudly and proudly brand new English-Spanish bilingual university in South Texas. Supposedly, according to them, the first fully English-Spanish bilingual university in the whole United States. That's a questionable claim, but I understand the spirit there. They're doing something huge. No one has ever done it at this scale, that's for sure. So this is the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley, or UTRGV, opened in 2015, so very young school, right? Now this is a big thing. This an officially English-Spanish bilingual university in the United States. And in the state of Texas, one of the weirdest states in the United States, right? And it's there. That's where it comes out. So while it's not the first bilingual institution, even though it claims to be, what I think is more important about UTRGV here is that it's one of the largest Hispanic serving institutions in the United States. But depending on how you slice up that data, those numbers, I think you could argue that this is the largest Hispanic serving institution in the United States. Something like 36,000 students, 91% identifying as Latinx, right? So this is a Latinx Mexican American university. Tons of bilinguals here. So they knew this and they thought, hey, if we were to try this English-Spanish bilingual idea, this would be the place to do it. And so they did. It's not going as smoothly as I would have liked, but that's part of the story today. So saying this university is important to Latinxes doesn't really do it justice. This is no less than an extraordinary, radical linguistic experiment whose possibilities are just beginning to emerge. And that it's in the radically conservative state of Texas just adds a very unique twist to the story. Now, in terms of the geographic context, in case you haven't heard of UTRGV or know where the Rio Grande Valley is, that's where we're at. So like I said, we're in deep South Texas. If you think of the shape of Texas, and then you pretend like you have a toe clipper and you clip the bottom of Texas, that is where we are. That is how south we are, the very bottom southern tip of Texas. And it's called the Rio Grande Valley. From one of the campuses, not this one, on the other side, you can actually see into Mexico. You can actually see like little people walking over there in the distance if you look really far. So that's the geographic location, the geographic context, so to speak. Now, in terms of theoretical inspiration, this is the fun part of my work. So the concept linguistic terrorism was originally formulated by South Texas native Chicana theorist Gloria Anzaldúa. She was from this exact region. She attended a campus named Pan American College in the 1960s, which was located in the exact same region of deep South Texas, where she and thousands of other students would be subjected to something called the speech test. And this is when Mexican students were lined up on registration day. They were forced to speak out loud for an administrator, And if they had an accent, they were immediately funneled into remedial speech and English courses. This was one of the primary inspirations, this moment, for linguistic terrorism, that kind of very embarrassing and blunt racism that she experienced when she was a child, or when she was a college student and a child. So the experience of growing up on the US-Mexico border and attending Pan American College would be central to Anzaldua's theory of linguistic terrorism, which foregrounded the degrading experience of being positioned as a substandard language user. But if I'm invoking Anzaldua's concept of linguistic terrorism that she developed at a university named Pan American College 40 years ago, how does that apply to UTRGV, this newly open, brand new, massive, officially bilingual university, where you would think maybe linguistic terrorism wouldn't exist at a place like this? Well, before it was called UTRGV, it was in fact named Pan American College, the exact same university that Gloria Anzaldúa attended, the exact same university with the speech test. So imagine that, going from a speech test to a fully bilingual university. It's a pretty big jump. So today I'll be trying to illustrate how that exact same standard versus substandard dichotomy that Anzaldúa wrote about 40 years ago with her original linguistic terrorism theory, I'm going to talk about how that exact same process continues today in this brand new university, supposedly very progressive. So it does seem that if there is any place to update this particular theory, it would be at this university and in South Texas, where Anzaldúa attended and lived. So let's begin by laying out the differences here between old linguistic terrorism and contemporary forms of what I call soft linguistic terrorism. Or sometimes I just call it soft terror, for short. Now that sounds like a contradiction. I'm pairing an extremely violent word, an extremely politically charged word, terrorism, with the word soft. Right? I assure you I'm not just trying to be cute. There are reasons for this, and they're going to become super clear as we move through the presentation. So I'm going to explain what soft linguistic terrorism is through 3 stories, 1 personal and then 2 from faculty members at this university. Let's start with the personal one first because it's the easiest one to follow and kind of the more interesting one as well. So, I grew up in this region of South Texas. So did my parents, and my family still lives there. My mom also attended the same university that I attended. It's a very small town type of feel. My own mother, who grew up here, vividly remembers how teachers used to strike students with rulers for speaking Spanish. She got struck a couple times, apparently. That is also Anzaldúa's experience as well. She even talks about that in her linguistic terrorism theory chapter, the experience of being hit in class. Now, okay, that was weird. So those are okay. Wow, got totally thrown off there. So those are explicit physical and psychological forms of old school linguistic terrorism. You're literally being hit by a ruler, right? Pretty simple. The pain and the embarrassment were the point of that kind of punishment. But today things are different. We're not allowed to hit children, usually. What we see now, though, is updated forms of linguistic terrorism. Violence in much softer form. The old school linguistic terrorism was based on punishment. The new school linguistic terrorism, the soft linguistic terrorism, uses softer methods of racial and linguistic governance. Now, by the word soft, this is where the word soft comes from, I'm invoking the specter of political soft power, which doesn't work through direct war and conquest, but more so through incentives and institutional leverage. For example, in Ukraine, we're not putting troops on the ground. That would be a direct expression of power using our own troops, right? But what we are doing is maybe feeding intelligence on the side or trying to bankrupt Russia, right? Those would be soft power techniques. So a direct violence would be putting the troops on the ground. A soft type of violence or soft power would be trying to bankrupt the country, right? Using institutions, leverage, and incentives to try to end the war. But ultimately, the end goal is the same. Whether we're putting troops on the ground or we're trying to bankrupt somebody, we're trying to end the war. Soft linguistic terrorism, like soft power, works through incentive and leverage. So we're talking about two different forms here of linguistic terrorism. An old, direct linguistic terrorism that used physical and psychological punishment. And now we have a new, updated, soft linguistic terrorism that uses incentive and leverage, which makes it look softer. But we cannot be fooled. The end goal is the same. American assimilation into English monolingualism. That is the end goal, whether it is old school linguistic terrorism or new school, soft linguistic terrorism. So, my mother's Spanish was literally beaten out of her via older forms of linguistic terrorism, the old school version. But my Spanish, something else happened to it. My Spanish was simply erased from my home. Now, remember, soft terror is all about incentives. My mother came to believe that English would protect me from racism, the racism that she experienced when she was a child. That became a very clear incentive for her to prioritize English in our household. It created the incentive to quite literally raise me in an English-speaking monolingual household. So we might say that my mom internalized the terror that she felt in that original moment back in the 1960s, that old linguistic terrorism. That old linguistic terrorism would eventually spin off into something else, into a leverage, into the leverage that erased my Spanish. After all, she was imagining that the American education system would harm me in some way, physically or otherwise. Physically, the way they harmed her, or otherwise. She believed that if she didn't prepare me to adopt particular American educational norms, I would be in danger. So this is a much softer form of linguistic terrorism that incentivized my own mother to choose to deprioritize Spanish in her family. Many Latinx parents have made this exact same choice. Either put your child in danger with Spanish, or hopefully keep them safe with English. But is that really a choice? Because if you ask me, that sounds like survival, not choice. But notice how my mother's child, me, was now feeling the effects of that original moment of old linguistic terrorism 10 to 15 years later, after that original event. Meaning not only does new linguistic terrorism appear softer, it can take an entire generation to actually manifest. In other words, soft terror can also be slow terror. But the end goal remains the same: assimilation into American linguistic norms. Whether it's achieved through the old physical forms of punishment, or whether it's achieved through newer, softer methods, like a mother trying to protect her child from harm. The effect is the same. Passing on Spanish was deprioritized in favor of English monolingualism. But the story of soft terror doesn't end there. There were moments, as a new 21-year-old high school teacher, me, when I tried to convince my Spanish-speaking students that they needed to learn English because it's the, quote, language of power. I used to preach this to them. English, language of power. I'd be like, if you want to graduate high school, if you want to get a good job, if you want to go to college, you have to prioritize English, right? I was like, sure, your Spanish, it's important for heritage and all that, all that stuff, that's cool. But English, that's what's going to bring you success. That's what's going to bring you money. It's going to bring you the jobs, right? I was preaching these types of things to them. Now notice, I'm promising rewards, like graduations, like high salaries, good jobs. All of that is incentive. At the same time, I was employing an institutional leverage over them. After all, I was implying, if you don't learn English, you're not going to pass my class, or you're going to fail high school, or you're never going to go to college, and you're never going to get a good job, right? The leverage was there too. So both the incentive and the leverage were there when I was trying to preach the power of English. Now notice, I was telling them to imagine a version of what their future could be. One leads to this upper-class American lifestyle. The other future was essentially this jobless, homeless, Spanish-speaking dystopia, right? But this is how soft linguistic terrorism works and how it appears softer. No one is saying racist stuff about the inferiority of Mexicans. No one is saying that. It looks like a conversation between choosing to use this language or that language to get ahead in life. In that conversation, only one of those languages holds the promise of social mobility. It's not the language of your culture. It's not the language of your home. It's standard language, formal language, the language of power. And let's remember some of the other names that it goes by as well. The language of school, the language of the marketplace, the language of business, the language of power. But perhaps we should say what we really mean. The language of elite, powerful members of society. That's what we mean when we say the language of power. Power is an idealized concept, right? Power doesn't have vocal cords to speak. It doesn't have hands to write. It doesn't experience racism. There is no language named power. So what are we really doing when we ask students, or when we instruct students, that the way forward in life is to learn the language of power? What are we actually doing in those moments? Because it sounds to me that we are prepping students to experience language as a hierarchy, first and foremost, before anything else. And it simply just does not have to be that way. Now, I don't know what happened to my former high school students that I was preaching the power of English to, but looking back, I wonder how many that I convinced via incentive, via leverage, that deprioritizing Spanish in their life was the right thing to do. Did I convince anybody? Was I complicit? Or rather, I'll rephrase that, I was complicit as an agent of soft terror in all of these moments. And this is like the superpower of soft terror. It can work through the good intentions of teachers. It can work through a mother protecting her child. So we gotta remember that even things like love and care and good intentions cannot and do not operate outside of power relations. If you're not careful, you can re-articulate hierarchy in ways that you didn't even mean to. So in that story, we have 3 generations there, all experiencing forms of linguistic terrorism, like a domino effect. We had my mom, the first victim of old terror, which had effects 15 years later with the birth of her son, the monolingual household. And then her son took those effects into his classroom an extra 21 years later. From here, I gotta wonder if my former students will continue these effects onto a 4th generation of Mexicans. Because essentially, it's their turn to take over the linguistic terrorism. So I always wonder how long I've extended the afterlife of linguistic terrorism in this region. I did real damage here, and I know that. Now, in social science research, and in American society in general, right, we want to find the person responsible, and then blame them, and cancel them, and all the other things. Now, in these cases, in the story that I just told you, who is actually to blame? Is it me for preaching the power of English? Is it my mom for the English-speaking household? Or perhaps we should blame the person that hit my mom like 50 years ago. Or maybe it wasn't even that person's fault. What if it was their training as a teacher that told them this is the way you teach Mexicans? Because that is how they thought they should teach Mexicans, through force. So I think finding people to blame makes people feel seen and legitimized, and that's fine, that's good. But finding someone to blame is much easier than trying to understand what's going on, what's happening, and how to stop it from continuing. So, one last reminder here. Soft terror works through incentive and through leverage, as opposed to regular physical, psychological punishment. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this idealized concept, standard language, was at the heart of linguistic terrorism theory. Specifically, the idea that Mexicans were not smart enough to learn standard English. With my mom, she was hit for using Spanish because it was believed it would taint her English. It would make her English impure. Right? So, indeed, with Mexicans and with Latinos in general in the United States, all their language is seen as mixed, accented, misinformed, not real English, not real Spanish, but Spanglish, Tex-Mex, etc., etc. So now let's continue to think about this idea of standard language, or the attempt to standardize language, and how it can be used as a technique of soft terror, specifically in a university. So this is when we actually go to this UTRGV. There was this moment reported by local scholar Stephanie Alvarez, current faculty member at UTRGV. She found a student who had points taken off of their Spanish exam because they didn't write their own surname with an accent. So let me repeat that. The instructor accused the student of misspelling their own name. Now, if this professor had done his due diligence, he would have known that in this region of Texas, names like Martinez and Garcia don't have accents, usually. They rarely ever have accents. The local norm is accentless names like Martinez. This even happened to my sister, except in a more extreme version. My sister's last name is Martinez. Her Spanish professor made her change the spelling of her name to Martinez with an S, because according to this professor, if she wasn't going to use an accent, then she needed to spell her name with an S as opposed to a Z at the end of Martinez. Right. Now, unfortunately, these professors are grading these students using grammatical rules and spellings from a different variety of Spanish, clearly. They're using an imagined standardized version of Spanish from a different country, essentially. But not just different grammatical norms, but the correct grammatical norms. That's how this professor was able to say, you spell your own name wrong. Because according to them, there is a correct way to spell a name. So in essence, this professor was saying, your local Spanish is wrong. A basic story. So this shows how standardization reaches far beyond just spoken language. It's an overall enforcement of correct standards. And they always seem out of reach, too. So before linguistic terrorism at this university came in the form of a speech test, which told locals explicitly, your language is inferior. Your local English is Tex-Mex, it's not real. Your Spanish is Spanglish, it's not real. Today there isn't a speech test, but linguistic terrorism in soft forms, including professors with red pens enforcing linguistic standardization in probably the weirdest place I've ever heard of, on the accent markings of a personal family name. So what happened to this student? We can hope that this whole incident was brushed off as involving just an ignorant instructor. But what if that student adopted these new grammatical norms and replaced their own cultural norms with these new standardized grammatical norms, right? Again, it's not like they had a choice. There was an institutional leverage there. Spell it the correct way, or I'll take off more points from your test, right? So it's not like they had a choice. Now, the one thing I am concerned about is what if this student suddenly began to think of his whole family as dumb and ignorant. After all, according to this university professor, his parents can't even spell their own name. Now, I don't think it's impossible for this student to get there, to get to this rationale. And there's reasons for this. In this local scene, there's a very common discourse conversation where Mexican youth make fun of their parents for being old and naive and clueless and old school and less Americanized, right? Old-fashioned parents and who only have a third grade education who say the word cheeseburger as cheeseburger, things like that. That's how the youth make fun of their parents. It's not really a race thing, it's an age thing, right? They're just saying they're old-fashioned. But I could imagine, though, in a culture where you're taught to respect the word of your elders, having a professor essentially confirm all of these local discourses about stupid Mexican parents, that could be something very, very powerfully convincing to this particular student. And it becomes yet another reason to replace local racialized norms with white American norms, with standard American norms. Now, what's so complex about this standard language thing concept? Like I said, it goes by many names, right? But one thing was certain. When it came to the local imaginings of standard language, it did not exist in South Texas. Nobody made that claim, ever, that it existed. It always came from somewhere else. Places like, standard Spanish from Argentina or Cuba, and of course, from Spain. Everybody says Spain, of course. The standard and correct Spanish is never found in Mexican homes, never found in South Texas, never found in Texas, never found in the United States. And this is a pattern, a pretty consistent pattern that emerges over and over again. People in this region just pointed somewhere else to find the good Spanish, the standard Spanish, but they never pointed to themselves. Now, let me give you an example of how these kinds of ideologies emerge in a regular class period. One current Mexican-American faculty member who grew up in South Texas, so this is his home, he said to his class, quote, I'm going to answer his class too, quote, I call it Mexico City Spanish, but it's like the correct Spanish. I don't know what they call it. Castellano? I think that's what it's called. I don't really remember. You should Google that. End quote. So in that conversation, this faculty member is locating a correct Spanish in a specific city in Mexico. Mexico City Spanish. That's where he thinks it exists. And he identifies it as possibly Castellano. What's important about a statement like this is that locally, many lifelong residents believe that correct Spanish comes from somewhere else, either Mexico or Spain. Now this faculty member reads, writes, speaks, grades papers, and conducts coursework in English and Spanish, so bilingually, fully. Yet he always characterized his own Spanish as not good enough. And he would make this claim that he just couldn't understand his transnational Mexican students because they spoke perfect Mexico City Spanish. So what he's saying is his Spanish was not good, therefore he could not understand his transnational students who spoke perfect Spanish. Now I saw that as kind of an activist thing to do because at the time it was very, at this moment it was very Trumpy in the banning immigrants time. So I saw this as kind of like the teacher reaching out to the transnational Mexican students, right, and being like, hey, I see you guys, and you guys speak wonderful Spanish, and you're very smart, etc., etc. The problem is, though, when he positions his own local Spanish as inferior to the transnational students, he is, by extension, positioning all of his local Mexican-American students' Spanish as also inferior. And it happened just like that, in a blink of an eye. Clearly, that's not what he intended to do, but remember, the superpower of soft terror is that it works through good intentions, just like that. Now, this brings me to the most elusive form of soft linguistic terrorism, and that's the institutional move toward positioning standard Spanish as an economic resource, meaning the Spanish language is becoming monetarily incentivized. Now, this sounds like a good thing, leading to the very, very popular discourse called the bilingual advantage, meaning you automatically have an advantage somehow because you are bilingual. Either you'll get a pay raise, you'll have access to better jobs, you'll get access to better colleges, etc., etc. Now, I worked here. Everybody's bilingual. I don't know a single person that was paid extra for being bilingual. Never heard of it. I live in New York right now. Every single bodega corner store is filled with immigrants that are bilingual. Do you think they get paid more than minimum wage? No. Right? So this bilingual advantage I'm highly skeptical of. But we continue to sell it. Let's look at what an administrator said. Quote, "I see that you come with your own language, and it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. We just need to work. I'm trying to add to it. I'm trying to expand it. I'm not trying to correct it. I'm not trying to erase it. But at the end of the day, you want students to know they can graduate and that they can find a job, and they'll be more marketable than the monolingual person with the same degree." End quote. So at this university, the home language is generally characterized as beautiful and enriching and something that must be honored, right? All of the flowery language that we like to use. And indeed, from this administrator, from what they said, it seems like good intentions all around. However, you have to pair this with something else that I figured out about this region of Texas. I never heard, not once, not ever, I never heard the home language described as already economically valuable. It was essentially worthless without a college degree. The only way for the local language user to claim any kind of linguistic value, their Spanish must be backed by university credentials that supposedly prove linguistic competence. And this proof is supposedly economically valuable. Only then can the language user become marketable and competitive in the global marketplace. Now, after a couple years of exploring all these examples of soft terrorism, something I noticed at the very beginning of conducting this research finally began to make sense. At the beginning stages, talking to dozens of faculty and students and things, I noticed this idea of standard language kept coming up, right? Standard language, formal language, the good language. So I just started asking people, where does standard language come from? Or who speaks standard language? The answer sounded like, Spain has pure Spanish, or people in Cuba speak the good Spanish, or my friend in Monterrey, Mexico speaks the proper Spanish. So in all those conversations, people pointed somewhere elsewhere, identifying every Spanish-speaking country in the world except the United States. And there was also one answer that I never heard, not once, from the dozens of interviews. Not one person ever said, "Oh, well, my mom speaks good Spanish," or my dad, or my grandma, or my grandpa. The best Spanish was never found in the home, never found in Texas, never found in the United States. So that became something I wanted to think about. Why don't we Latinos believe or consider our own Spanish to be good enough to be considered a standard Spanish? Now, as already mentioned, everyone in this room is a non-standard language user, but only minoritized and racialized folks will be punished for it. Today, those violent punishments have mutated into friendly-looking incentives. And those incentives are generally pressed into existence through various forms of institutional leverage. After all, did my mom not teach me Spanish because she didn't want to? Or because the education institution resembled a threat to the safety of her child, right? Who is to blame? Perhaps we should blame the lady that hit my mom, perhaps it's not even the lady's fault. Maybe it's the institutional policy that encouraged physical harm to teach those poor little Mexicans. So maybe it wasn't even that teacher's fault. And this is what they mean when we claim that racism is systemic. It works through long chains of racial terror that severely blurs the blame game. It's hard to decide who is most responsible for what happened. And what makes it even more complicated is that sometimes it takes generations so that you can actually see the linguistic terrorism emerge. And now that standard language is being propped up by capitalist models of language, the waters are becoming deeper and darker, because now standard languages are gaining value in the economic marketplace. And for whatever reason, public schools think standard Spanish will bring advantages to Latinx communities, the so-called bilingual advantage I was talking about. I can say I sincerely want a bilingual advantage for my people. That sounds like a totally good thing. But anytime that I see something that might look like an advantage, it seems to be completely canceled out by regular old racism, regular old linguistic discrimination. Now, there's plenty of published data that shows there is no bilingual advantage without a college degree. That work exists. In fact, if you don't have a college degree and you're bilingual, often bilinguals are given extra work to do, such as translating for the boss, or speaking to staff, customers, made to do specialist translation work, all for no extra pay. If we said that a different way, we could also say that these persons were getting more work to do, getting paid the same, which means they're actually getting paid less by how much work that they actually do. That sounds like a bilingual disadvantage, not an advantage. Also sounds like exploitation. Now, I've got to admit though, I have seen some very successful bilingual folks. That is fact, I have seen them. There are individuals that land big corporate jobs. I'm sure they're financially well off, but they're not just bilingual. They usually have master's degrees and they usually know 3 languages. So, but nevertheless, isn't that some kind of advantage, right? I mean, they got the job for their language skills. For that, I'd be like, yeah, sure, they got the job for their language skills and their degree, just the way a math teacher with a math degree would be hired for a math position, right? And this is what I'm having trouble wrapping my head around. Are we really thinking of a bilingual advantage, or is this the advantage that you get automatically from having a college degree? I can't actually tell. Now, when it comes to a larger community group advantage, so not just individuals making a lot of money, is there going to be an advantage for Latinos in general, or any minoritized group? For this, the group version of the bilingual advantage, I have seen no evidence for. But I do see this one thing that scholars love to say over and over and over and over and over again. They will say, this is like the underlying conclusion to this bilingual advantage idea. They'll say, well, we can't find an advantage right now, but someday in the future, if the market goes the way that it's going right now, we are 100% sure that it's possible. We're giving it a 100% chance of a maybe, that this will maybe become an advantage someday. Maybe. And that's the most they'll commit. They'll get up to that line of saying like, yeah, it's an advantage, or okay, it'll be an advantage one day. That's not something that I am totally going to buy. And there's reasons for this. Now, yeah, so scholars are already seeing the effects of this capitalist model of language. And it's already have gentrifying effects on bilingual education programs, where you're seeing bilingual education programs that would normally be put in, let's say, a poorer neighborhood or maybe a neighborhood that had a bigger immigrant population, we're seeing those bilingual programs now being shifted to upper class white neighborhoods. And why? Well, because standard languages are becoming valuable. So wouldn't it seem kind of predictable that more people would now be interested in acquiring this thing called standard language, especially if there's an economic component to it? And that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing all of these upper class elite neighborhoods pretty much pulling away all of those dual language bilingual education programs away from the people that need it over here to upper class neighborhoods. Now, should we be surprised that this is happening? The last time I checked, capitalism has never been in the business of equality. In a capitalist regime, equality does not sell. So if we're assigning economic value to one language, one standard language, but not applying any kind of economic value to non-standard languages, we should expect capitalist hierarchies to be reproduced within the language itself. Because that's just the way capitalism works, through hierarchy. So we should expect those capitalist hierarchies to be reproduced via linguistic discrimination, via linguistic terrorism. And that's exactly what's happening. Unfortunately, though, this will be the last thing I say here, those capitalist models, those capitalist hierarchies, will be invisible to most folks. Making this move to increase the monetary value of standard language, but specifically this move to institutionally incentivize standard language, to economically incentivize the adoption of standard languages. This could be potentially one of the softest forms of linguistic terrorism to date. Thank you.
We have time for questions. If people want to hang out just a little bit, just stand and project.
So your example about your own anecdote in the high school setting as a teacher, you mentioned that it would be slightly racist or you something racist to teaching students to prioritize English.
Sort of said that, but not really. Okay.
How would you, I don't want to put words in my mouth, how would you phrase that?
The constant positioning of Spanish as inferior, as inferior.
Right.
That's the racist part.
Okay, perfect.
Not necessarily teaching English. That's not. I thought that was my computer over there. Anyway, go for it.
So in a predominantly speaking, like a predominantly English-speaking country, I find it hard to see a problem with not prioritizing English, but making it a point of learning English would benefit you in some way, which in a predominantly speaking English country, that seems like it should be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree with you. Now, the tricky part about that question is that it sounds like I am implying to you that you shouldn't learn English and you should learn Spanish instead, right? And that's totally not what teachers generally are doing. They want students to learn both languages, not one or the other, right? So when we ask questions like, well, isn't it beneficial to learn English in an English-speaking society, right? The answer clearly is yeah, it is. But I sense there's a question after that, where people are starting to think, so if this is an English-speaking country, why even waste time with any other language, right? That's usually the follow-up to that question, right? And then that's where I would say, well, for one thing, the United States wasn't always a Spanish, English-speaking country. That's fact. There's a huge part of this area, the domestic language of the area was Spanish, not English. right? So you can find areas like this where the domestic language is Spanish first before English. So there's a history component there. But then if you want to be like very simplistic about it, we don't have a national language, an official language, right? Not officially anymore. But yeah, I definitely take your point. I would never say that learning English is not beneficial. That's not true. Right? It just sounds sometimes when people like me receive questions that sound like that. It sounds, I'm not saying you're doing it, but just so that we know that what it sounds like to me. It sounds like an accusation that I'm saying you should prioritize your home language over English. And I'm not necessarily saying that. I'm saying we shouldn't discriminate against people who do not speak English. That's my ultimate position, right? Don't discriminate against people that don't speak English. I think everybody can rally around that, I think. Hopefully. Yeah. But yeah, good question. Excellent question.
All right, so in your speech you were talking about how people really don't benefit from like this bilingualness, but then you were kind of talking about towards the end like how these bilingual programs are starting to move to upper class neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if the bilingual advantage, if you will, doesn't maybe help marginalize or BIPOC groups, but it might help people who are non-marginalized or white people.
Yes. That's exactly probably the way I would see it too. Maybe like since we're at the very beginning stages of this, well, not the beginning stages. We're at the beginning of this shift. At some point, it's going to flip into what you just said. It's just going to become an advantage for people that are already elite, and they'll just have a bigger advantage now, right? So we're trying to create these programs for minoritized populations, but then folks kind of just see something good happening down there, and they just kind of swoop in and take it. Yeah, capitalism, right? Yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
So I know you briefly touched topic on remedial classes, and I wanted to ask you, like, putting kids who predominantly speak Spanish at a young age, putting them into remedial classes in like elementary school, does that create an advantage or a disadvantage? Just because from experience, while other kids in my class were learning math, higher language, English, social skills, things like that, I was still learning the basics of the language. Do you think that's an advantage or a disadvantage or something?
I think that model where you try to learn a language completely like autonomously, like using lists of vocabulary words and conjugations and all that stuff, to me that model is not very effective. I would much rather the students be in, let's say, a fully dual language bilingual classroom where the whole class all day long is taught in English and in Spanish. Because the way you learn language is through the practice of it, right? You just have to put in the numbers. So, I mean, to me, it feels like common sense that doing it this way, where it's 100% English and Spanish all the time, would be the fastest. At least, I mean, I don't have any data to back it up, but it seems kind of commonsensical to me. So, in terms of the actual programs, right? Some of them are extremely common, and there's any kind of advantage anyway, right? Like if you're a student that's already, let's say you're a brand new immigrant, you're already feeling lonely, and then you're pulled out of your classes, and you're made to sit over there in the corner to learn by yourself with the teacher's aid or something, right? That's gonna make things worse for the student probably. So it kind of goes like school by school. You can have an amazing bilingual program right here, and then across the street you can have a terrible. And they can be living that close to each other. So it's very like hit and miss when it comes to like individual experiences. Good question. Anyone else?
Love you here. You're thinking stuff.
I swear I'm really nice. I look weird. Or if not, I have a request. Can we take a selfie? Yeah. Okay.